is this thing rolling? It's rolling? Okay, awesome. So what's up? My name is Jaheed, and for those of you who can't tell, this is my, first YouTube video, in case that wasn't obvious by this like low-key painful introduction. But for those of you who don't know me, I am an author, I am a writer, I'm a poet. I am also trying to make sure I'm looking at the camera right now. I wear glasses, man. I'm doing my fucking best. I don't know. I'm an avid martial artist. I love all things anime and books, and I am actually on TikTok at HeavyDescribe, as I'm sure some of you already know, because a lot of you probably just came from there onto here. And excuse me. All right, and I thought I had a point I was trying to make somewhere, and I kind of lost it. Oh yeah, I found it. There we go. But yeah, I've decided that one of my goals for 2023 was to expand my platform and my content and my brand and my reach a little bit. So I thought, hey, why not go on YouTube? That's where all the cool kids hang out. So now here I am, hoping to talk about books and maybe say enough words so to like distract y'all from the fact that I really don't know what I'm talking about. But anyway, since 2023 is like tomorrow and some change away, I figured why not just have my first video be what were my top 10 books of this year, of 2022. I make lists, me and my best friend make lists. So that's what I want this first video to be about. And before I actually just get into that, I know a lot of you aren't even listening to like the nonsense coming out of my mouth right now, and you're looking at these two super sexy towers of books right here. And I just want to go ahead and say, I haven't read like half of this shit yet. So when I get into like my top 10 and you're like, oh my God, how dare you not have Iron Widow in your top 10? I ain't read it yet, okay? I'm getting there. Like most of the books I haven't even touched. They just look pretty, and I just picked them up because I don't have any impulse control. You know how it goes. You're in the bookstore, you're like, hey, I'm only gonna spend $30. But then you see that sexy ass hardcover and you're like, okay, but like I'll make more money next week. What's wrong if I spend 100 instead of 30? That's what happened, and this was like the prettiest assortment of books that I had, and I just wanted something that would look nice. So anyway, I'm rambling. That being said, let's get into the top 10, but haha, I actually lied to you. Before we get into the actual top 10, I made like 4 other subcategories for books I had this year, and that is, yeah, this isn't a script, but this is a list because I don't trust myself to just go off the top, or I'm gonna start talking about like walruses or some shit, and I don't wanna do that. So those 4 subcategories were my most surprising read of the year, the book I thought I'd love that I didn't, a book I thought I'd hate that I'd love, and my most disappointing read of the year. So let's get into those before we get into the actual top 10. So I'm just gonna turn these cool kids to the side. All right, most surprising read of the year. Let's do that one first. So let's just, yeah. All right, cool. So my most surprising read of the year was The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. This was actually my first book I read that was historical fiction. Historical fiction, there we go. I know how to English, right? Maybe if I didn't talk so fast, I would do better. Let's try that. So as I was saying, The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. This was my first dabble into like historical fiction, and I really enjoyed the kind of jump back and forth from past to present. And I'm trying not to spoil these books too much, right? Because that could be its own different video. But as someone who mainly reads for characters, this was a book that kept me interested not by the people, but by the story. And that was just something different than what I was used to. I really enjoyed the small twist that came towards the end about how the main character was tied into the character of the past and the main character's relationship with her spouse. It was a really fun read. I enjoyed it. I read it in a few days, and I was genuinely surprised by how much I liked this because this is not up my alley. So yeah, most surprising read of the year, The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. All right, next we have a book I can read my handwriting. Let me try this again. And next we have a book I thought I'd love that I didn't. This one was easy. So this was Rabbits by Terry Miles. Please don't actually ask me what this book was about because I 100% don't know. The gist of it from the little bit of this book I could like comprehend and understand is that this was supposed to be about, or the concept of everything is a simulation. We're living in like a Matrix-esque type world, and that's like right up my alley. I love conspiracy theories. I love stuff like that. I love like the whole concept of like a 3D and a 5D world. And I really thought this was gonna be like top 5 book of the year for me, but while the concept was interesting, the presentation felt incredibly rushed and at times a bit confusing, especially because towards the end of the book, we started introducing concepts like quantum time jumping in parallel dimensions. And I can't remember who said it, but the idea of if you can't explain something to a 6-year-old means you don't understand it yourself. I feel like that was kind of missing from this editing process, because like the last 60 pages or so, I was like, wow, this is really cool, but like what the fuck is happening though? Like I was confused for most of the ride, and it felt like from at some point we transitioned from like an actual novel to like an acid trip on paper. Like, so that just kind of threw me. All right. Next, we have a book I thought I'd hate that I loved. Okay, this one was easy. This is I Fell in Love with Hope by Lynn. So this was, I hope I'm saying that right, because she's French. I don't know if this is supposed to have like some kind of French pronunciation. I'm doing my best, bro. But, okay, camera's right there. Look at the camera. So, I'm really doing my best, y'all. So this is actually a self-published book by an author on TikTok by the same name, Lynn. And me and my best friend, we actually kind of got this book as a joke. I'd finished reading a book that was published by a self-published author that I wound up DNFing because it was very clear that the author did not put a level of care and intentionality and effort into the story that it deserved. And I'd kind of been noticing this trend with some self-published books that I was reading, that they seem to be of like a lesser quality than traditionally published books. And I just want to say, as like a complete preface, I'm not saying that traditionally published books are better than self-published books, because that's not the case at all. But I am saying that self-published authors are sometimes able to get away with certain creative and editing decisions because their book is at the mercy of their budget, and they can kind of cut corners here and there. And that's something that doesn't happen with a traditionally published book. That's what I'm trying to say. So anyway, I just was on the cusp of finishing a poorly written novel, and I kind of got this as like a joke, because I was like, obviously this isn't going to be good. It's going to be like, I expected like much of the same of what I just finished reading. So when I ordered this, it came on a Friday at 3 p.m. I had very low expectations. This is a 420 page novel, came at a Friday on 3 p.m. I finished it by 11 a.m. the next Saturday. It was that good. It was phenomenal. This book sucked me in from the first page. Like, I remember I got it, I read from like 3 p.m. to like 3 a.m. I went to sleep for like 6.5, 7 hours. I woke up at 9:30 or 10, and I was done by 11. Like, this book just completely sucked me in. I'm going to talk about it a little more later, so I'm not going to go too in depth on it right now. But this was a book that I just thought I would not enjoy, that I wound up falling in love with. And the book is called I Fell in Love with Hope. Look at me having like puns and stuff like that. Please don't click off. I'm doing my best. Okay, next. My most disappointing read of the year. Okay, that's really easy. Let me just move these out of the way right quick. So, most disappointing read of the year was easily The Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake? Ollivander? By Olivia, okay, we're gonna go with Olivia, by Olivia Blake. So I enjoyed The Atlas 6. That was actually one of my top 10 books of this year. But, okay, I gotta find a place to look. All right, we're gonna figure this out at some point. Anyway, but The Atlas Paradox felt like the author forgot all of the magic that made the first book so different and so special, and just left it out of this book. This book is probably one of the most passive stories I've ever read. And what I mean is that I felt like the cast spent the majority of their page time waiting for things to happen to them. And that's one of two ways a plot can happen. Again, a plot can either be characters taking action and then things happen as a result of that action, or things happen to your characters and then we have a story. And the first scenario creates what I feel is like dynamic characters, and the second creates more passive, sitting around twiddling our thumb characters. And that's what this book felt like a lot of sitting around and just like, you know, the kind of conversations you have with yourself at 3 a.m. when you think nobody else is awake and you start debating all like the really weird philosophical like questions you have that you never voiced to anyone else. This book felt like a lot of that, but like out loud. And it was a whole lot of nothing happening with the promise that something was going to happen later if you just stuck around long enough to get to the end of it. And personally, I'm not a fan of that writing style. And I expected so much more. I don't know if depth is the right word, but I just left reading this book feeling unfulfilled and like disappointed. So yeah, The Atlas Paradox was definitely my most disappointing read of this year. And that being said, now that we've covered those 4 subcategories, goodness gracious, we're 11 minutes in. We love to see it. This is fantabulous. Let me take a quick break to take a sip of my big ass water bottle. Yummers. All right, so now we can get into like my actual top 10, and we're gonna go 10 to 1. So, oh shit, where did I put it? There we are, there you are. All right, so number 10, my number 10 book of the year is A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab. And this is actually a conclusion to the A Darker Shade of Magic trilogy, which I really enjoyed it for what it was. So as a reader, I read books for people, and I didn't exactly fall in love with this cast, which not to say they were poorly written or anything. I'm very specific about what I look for in characters, but I did enjoy this magic system. I enjoyed the Antari. I enjoyed the villains. I enjoyed Kel. I loved Delilah. I loved Holland. I loved Alucard. I really just enjoyed these character dynamics, their relationships with each other. I loved the stakes. I loved the world. And I felt like this was a really solid conclusion to a memorable trilogy, and it's supposed to get adapted into a TV show, and I am definitely looking forward to seeing that in the future. So that was my number 10 book. All right, number 9, which some people are going to consider straight up blasphemous, but I'm okay with that. I can handle the smoke. That is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. And again, this is another one of those books where I wouldn't normally pick up just because I don't usually read historical fiction like this. But everyone on Book Talk was just talking about how this book was like a real tearjerker and made them cry. And I was like, that's gotta be cap. Let me read it and see, just so I can like go through the entire thing and not get emotional about it. And this turned out to be another one of those books I read in a short amount of time. I believe I read this in like 3 days. And I really just enjoyed, if I butcher his name, y'all don't get mad at me. Pete. You know what? Okay, we're calling him Petrofiel. We're calling him Petro for short. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I really enjoyed his relationship with Achilles. Now, the reason this is number 9 is because I did not like Achilles as a character, and because characters are so important for me. If I don't like your people in your story, that's going to make the book less enjoyable for me as a reader. That's not a knock on the author. That's not a knock on the book. That's just me and my preferences. And because I wasn't the biggest fan of Achilles, especially with what happened at the end and how he treated a certain character, Briseus, I have this book a little higher up in my top 10 list, but overall it was a solid story, a solid exploration of young male love and youth, and it was a fun read for the most part. Okay, now number 8, this was actually really surprising for me, but it is Seasonal Fears by Shannon McGuire. This is kind of like a sequel, kind of like a companion novel to Middle Game, which came out in 2000 and, okay, I don't know if it came out in 2020, don't quote me on that. I just know that in 2020 is when I read this book, and Middle Game was another one of those books where I read it in like 15, 16 hours, something crazy like that. And it was my number 1 book of the year, and I had really high hopes and expectations for this book, but for me, this book kind of had the same problem that I felt like Atlas Paradox did, in that I just felt like it was a whole lot of passive characters to me. And that is to me. I could be completely wrong. I could be misinterpreting, misreading the story, but the way I internalized it is this was like how many pages is this? Let me see. This is a almost 500 page book that is it felt like it didn't need to be as long as it was. And not only that, I was not a huge fan of the main characters. What are their names? Harry and Melanie, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. I loved Jack, but this was a book that felt longer than what it was because I just did not connect with the characters. I thought the plot was interesting. I liked the idea about the incarnations of like summer and winter and the passing of the crown. That was a really interesting concept to me. But the characters for me here were kind of like the weak link in the chain. And if it was not for Jack, I don't, and like again, the appearance of some of my favorite characters from Middle Game who did make a small and brief cameo. If it wasn't for those two things, I feel like this book might have ranked lower in my top 10 list. Or it might not have even made the top 10, which is really a really sad thing to think about because Shannon Maguire is one of my favorite authors. All right, that being said, number 7, we have Beasts of Prey by Ayana Gray. That rhymes, that's brazy, right? And so she and I are actually friends on TikTok, and I felt like I might as well go read her book and see what it's about. And for those of you who aren't familiar with me and my content, it is a pretty much well-known fact that I am not a fan of YA fantasy. To me, a lot of it reads really cliche, and I just don't feel like I am the target audience for these types of books. So I try to stay away from them because I don't like to go into books when I know I'm gonna have like a clear bias. I don't feel like that's fair to the author, and I don't feel like that's fair to the story. But this book actually surprised me. I enjoyed the characters, I enjoyed the world, I enjoyed the magic system. I felt like this was one of the few YA books that I have read, YA fantasy books, where a young protagonist. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit. I felt this was one of the few YA fantasy books I read where the author did not confuse immaturity with stupidity, because I feel like that is a mistake sometimes authors make in that they don't really know how to write young people and they think immature equals stupid, and there's like a very fine line between the two. And I just get really exhausted reading about books where characters who are like between the ages of like, let's say like 13 and 17 are portrayed as dumb because they're young. I feel like this did something differently. I did not see the plot twist coming, and I enjoyed how the magic system was rooted and steeped in, I believe, what was it, Yoruba mythology. And I really enjoyed this read, and I'm excited to read Beasts of Ruin because I have not yet. All right, so number 6, hey, I just talked about your sequel, is actually The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. And for me, I really enjoyed a lot of what made this book special, which was mainly the character conversations and the relationship dynamics. I feel like that was the selling point of this book, and I loved how the characters had abilities that fit their personalities. I've always been a huge, massive fan of that, when I feel like a character has a power that is representative of who they are at their core. And I just really enjoyed that. Again, as I'm sure you'll learn if you don't know this already, I don't read books for plots, I read books for people. And now, what I will say, this book can be difficult to get into because like more than half of the cast, there's 6 perspectives we mainly spend time with. You can argue that 4, possibly 5 of those characters are infuriating, and being in their heads for too long can be exhausting. But for the 2 characters, in my opinion, who made up for that kind of, arguably 3, the 2 arguably 3 characters that made up for the others kind of, I don't want to say banality, but their kind of exhausting nature in a way, they carried this book, and I really, really enjoyed it. So that's why Atlas 6 was my number 6. So number 5, I just got shit all over the place now, was the Once and Future Witches by Alex D. Harrow. I really am a big fan of this author. The 10,000 Doors of January was like my number 3 book of 2021, and I'm a big fan of everything she writes. And I read this at the beginning of the year, so I need to refresh myself on what it's about. But slow down, boy. But from what I do remember, this was a really fun read. I love the sisters. I loved Belladonna, was my favorite. I absolutely loved her. I love the twist that came regarding the antagonist towards the like, I call it like the falling action of the book. I really loved that. I genuinely enjoyed the plot of the story, which is something I don't say often because I just don't read for plots. But the selling point for me was the relationship between the sisters and how they kind of separated and came back together again, and they kind of had to reunite and heal their semi-fractured relationship in order to come together and use their magic to combat against a greater evil. I really love that. So that was my number 5. My number 4 is The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Delilah Harris. And this is another book where I was kind of stepping out of my comfort zone because I hadn't read too much Black fiction prior to this point, and that's something I'm trying to do better about doing. And this was a book that kept me quite literally engaged and gripped from the moment I entered the story and entered this world. This is one of the few books where I had a visceral reaction to an ending. I was so upset and so emotional by how this book ended. I finished it, I stood up, I went downstairs, I dropped the book in front of my mom at the table, shook my head, and walked upstairs. This was a phenomenal read. It really portrays and captures the Black experience, especially in some predominantly white work environments, incredibly well, and I related to a lot of what the main character goes through, and also kind of the struggle of not feeling Black enough. And it's just a phenomenal read, and even if you aren't Black or you're a different race, that's fine. It's still an engaging and gripping story, and it takes some turns and travels down some avenues I wouldn't have expected, and that makes for a very compelling and fascinating read. So that was my number 4. Number 3, my number 3 book, Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. Oh my sweet Black fucking Lanta. When I tell you that I did not think I would ever have a YA fantasy book that would surpass Six of Crows, and then I read this 520-page super sexy behemoth, and I was pleasantly blown away. This book is now my favorite YA fantasy book of all time. It is phenomenal. It has an incredible cast, an incredible magic system, an incredible history and mythology, and its magic system is beautiful. I loved Bree, I loved Alice. Okay, I don't know if I say I loved Nick, but Nick was cool. Nick was cool people. We were fucking with Nick, okay? I loved Sel, I loved Greer, and it felt so refreshing to read a fantasy book and be able to directly relate to the protagonist. I feel like that's not an experience I've had a lot, and I can't even really explain it. This is just a book that gripped me from start to finish, and I was engaged, and it took so many turns, and there were so many unexpected plot twists. I love the exploration of bloodcraft and rootcraft. This magic is incredible, and I'm actually currently reading Bloodmarked right now, and I can already tell based off what I've read, that'll be in my top 10 of next year, and if not my top 10, my top 15. But Legendborn was absolutely phenomenal. Now, for the big spice, number 2. Okay, you're in the way. I'm gonna need you to like slide onto the left. Thank you, my brother in Christ. All right, so number 2 was Nona the Ninth by Tamsin. I don't know how to say her last name after all these years, and I'm not gonna try now. But this was actually not only is it my number 2 book of the year, it was my most highly anticipated book of 2022. Gideon the Ninth is my favorite fantasy book of all time, and it was my number 1 book of last year, and Harold the Ninth was in my top 10 of last year as well. And I very, very rarely ever have an author more than once in my top 10. I try to avoid doing that. I love the Gideon the Ninth. I love the Locked Tomb universe, and Nona herself as a character is just so different from Gideon and Harold, and she just feels like a case study in innocence and purity, and not necessarily youth, but in that sort of like unconditional love. And I just adore her character so much, and it was so refreshing to get back into the same universe with some of my favorite characters. I enjoyed seeing Camilla and Palamides and Pyra, and I thought it was really clever how all of those chapters featuring John and Harold, the chapter titles were like biblical references, like, John like 3:4 or something like that. I really enjoyed that. Now, I will admit, I'm gonna admit this with full transparency, I didn't know what the fuck was going on at the end of this book. I genuinely was so confused. I was so confused in typical Locktoon fashion that after I finished this book, I had to go read Gideon the Ninth again, then read Hero the Ninth, then read Nona the Ninth in succession. And even when I did that, I still didn't know what the fuck was going on. So I had to go on Wikipedia and go read the plot summary that broke it down to me like I was fucking 2, and I was upset because I couldn't put the circle block in the triangle hole. That's how I felt trying to understand this, and I needed someone to explain it to me like I was that kid trying to put the circle block in the triangle hole. So I went onto Wikipedia and I read the plot summary of the book, and it broke down what happened, and I finally got what this story was about, and my mind was just blown, and I loved it. This book was phenomenal, and I actually planned on it being my #1 book of the year, and the reason that it was not is because of I Fell in Love with Hope by Lynn. This book literally came out of nowhere and swept the entire competition. This is a book that, this is the only, yeah, I can go ahead and make that statement. This is the only book I read this year that I felt like made me genuinely feel in my soul. This was my book where when I finished it, I had to go and sit in a dark room with the lights off and just kind of contemplate my place in the universe. Like, this book had soul. The journey of these characters and their relationships, Sunny, Neo, Sam, okay, I can't pronounce the last two, Hickory, and we're gonna call him C because he's a French name, I don't know how to say it, but their characters were just so captivating and mesmerizing, and I was moved. I felt them on the page. They were there, right? Like, everything from Neo's bitterness and his cynicism and his kind of resentfulness towards life to like C's just his simple, kind, carefree innocence. And then you had Sunny, who had this bright radiance, and you had Hickory, who was just kind of like, I'm trying to think of a good way to describe her character, but I don't know, she was kind of like if a sunset was a person. That's the best way I can think of to describe her. And then you had Sam, who was kind of like the glue holding these two together. And it's a story that connects the past with the present, with like dreams of the future. And it just was an incredible debut novel from an author I am really excited to see more from in the future. I will definitely be reading this again and most likely annotating it. It is also one of the first books that genuinely got me close to tears. Like, I've never read a book and cried before, but I almost got there with this one. So yeah, that is my okay, am I looking at the right spot? Fuck it, I'm gonna just pick this and just look at this. That is my top 10, or those are my top 10 books of 2022. If you stuck around this long, you were absolutely goated, because this shit is almost 30 minutes long. I tried not to ramble. I was doing my best. I've done most of this in one take. I'm really excited to make more videos and talk more about books. I'd love to hear in the comments what your top 10 books of 2022 were, and if you read some of the books that I read, or if you read some of the books that were in like my really tall book towers. I'd love to hear what your opinions and thoughts were. And I'd also like to know, what are some books you are excited for going into 2023? I can tell you, my most anticipated book is obviously Alecto the Ninth. But yeah, that's all I've got. I should probably have like an outro slide out video or some cool shit, but I don't. So I'm just gonna say thank you again for your time. I appreciate it. And yeah, signing out.